Welcome to Uncensored Beat.
I showed up. US citizen is not permitted entry.
Cover the next big attack.
Zelensky's seemingly fraudulent election.
Hello and welcome to Uncensored Beat, where we bring you the unfiltered truth on domestic and international news. My name is Flor Blanco.
And I'm James on the go, Bradley.
The topic of today's discussion is tracing U.S. funds to Ukraine and how the funds are to be used. The topic is rather extensive, and we'll be providing the details in several parts.
The first part of our investigation is a deeper dive into the 10-year bilateral security agreement President Joe Biden signed in June 13, 2024.
Now, this agreement binds the U.S. to provide material, training, and security and defense forces to help Ukraine.
This is being done to fulfill the minimum security and military requirements needed for Ukraine to become a member of NATO.
This is very concerning. There's a lot of controversy and information about the expansion of NATO and Russia. This expansionism, it's painted in a way it's similar to historical colonial imperialistic events in the past.
That is linked to the history of NATO's and Gorbachev, the former president of the Soviet Union and Russia. Why does NATO continue to expand? That's the question we should be asking. Stated in the preamble and the agreement itself, the U.S. is reaffirming that Ukraine's future is in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. The agreement refers to Ukraine's inherent right of self-defense as enshrined in Article 51 of the UN Charter.
And the bilateral agreement seems to present the establishment of a U.S. war-based industry in Ukraine. It was signed with only about half of the American public favoring support for Ukraine, according to a poll taken in May 2024.
Some perspectives suggest the interest in Ukraine by Europeans and Americans is to regain the lost territory. This is being done using NATO to fulfill an expansionist goal. A 2014 interview with Gorbachev published in Russian Beyond claims that this view is false. And Gorbachev confirmed that there's no agreement stating NATO could not expand into the former Soviet Union territories like Ukraine.
When NATO was created, it was promoted as an organization that was a purveyor of democracy, freedom, and individual liberty, made to combat the threat of spreading communism throughout Europe. When the Berlin Wall fell and the former Soviet Union and Western Europe planned on reunifying Germany, the intention of the effort was to work together.
Putin has claimed that NATO's movements were a violation of the agreement made between former Soviet Union, the US, and Western Europe in the late 1980s and early 1990s, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, ending the Cold War.
When the Berlin Wall fell and the Cold War ended, the focus was on reunifying Western Germany, which represented the democratic side of Germany, and Eastern Germany, which was governed under Soviet communism.
However, national security archives during that time documenting communications between US, Soviet, and European officials were declassified. These documents suggest the intent in the Arab discussions were to ensure NATO do not move 1 inch eastward into the former Soviet countries. This was done as a condition of the US and the Soviet nuclear disarmament.
Could it be that the U.S. is involved with Ukraine to support NATO expansion? Or is it allegedly to cover up for Biden?
Is Putin really fighting against Zelensky or NATO? What does Russia have to say? And now over to our foreign correspondents focusing on the Eastern Europe bloc. Alex says, hi, Alex. Say hello to everybody.
Hi, James. Thank you for having me on your show. Today we're doing the show from Quebec, the communist capital of North America. If you live in California and you think you live in a socialist state, come visit Quebec, the home of socialized suicide medicine.
So, Alex, what do Russians think about the United States?
As you know, I was in Russia during the beginning stages of the special operation, which now grew into full-blown proxy war. But even so, most of the Russians can separate the politics of politicians and the country and its people from the rest. So most of the Russians still support good relations with US. They still like the country, they like the values, they like the freedom that the only constitution that actually awards you freedom in the way that it protects your natural law. And most of Russians would actually tell you that they do not want to have any kind of animosity or Cold War point two with Russia.
What do the Russians think about Ukraine?
Well, most Russians would tell you that Ukrainians are brothers and sisters, and they also can separate the difference between the politics and the people themselves. Russians do not want war. Russians do not want people dying on both sides. But they do feel as if Ukraine has been sold out to economical and political interests, and they feel badly for Ukrainian people.
What do they think about NATO's expansion?
What do Russians think about NATO? It's an interesting question. Most people don't really care. People that are into politics, they'll understand and they'll explain that expansion of NATO to the Russian borders is a no-no. But majority of the people, NATO is not concerned to them, especially they do understand that America has the greatest impact on NATO in terms of the military might and financial support for NATO. So when you ask that question, Russians associate NATO with America. And obviously, they do not like America sponsoring the conflict in Ukraine as it is happening right now.
If you or they had three wishes, how would they improve U.S. and Russian relations?
Well, if you ask people in a comedic way, a lot of them want to visit the World Cup in 2026. So they're hoping by then all the proxy war and the Cold War 2.0, is over and people be able to get visas to go enjoy the sport that they all love and they share in common. Classic divide and conquer. Don't have much hope for the political structure, or here comes the new boss, so to speak. They do not have much hope in a political structure or the shadow government of the United States and whoever runs the White House right now. So they wish the Americans themselves figured out their internal politics.
What are your feelings about Gorbachev?
Well, that's an interesting question, because in the West, Gorbachev was a hero, but in Russia, Gorbachev isn't considered as a hero because technically he did ruin the greatest country on earth at a time, right? Even though it was falling apart and crumbling on its own weight. Gorbachev is not seen as a cultural hero. No, does Yeltsin. Yeltsin is contributed to selling of the Russian assets, people's assets, so to speak, to the Western interests. And as you are aware that Putin is about 70 to 80% very well liked. They definitely opposition, and people don't agree with all of his politics and all of his actions. And some people will actually tell you that the freedoms have been infringed in the last few years in regards to freedom of speech in relation to voicing their opinion to the war. But majority of the people will support Putin as the local hero.
What are your friends and your feelings about Donald J. Trump, Kamala Harris, and Robert Kennedy Jr., and who would be the best president?
That's an interesting question, because for the most Russians, they don't have much trust in American politics. They do believe it's run by the special interests, the shadow government, if you will. So they don't really believe that anything that's coming right now is somewhat honest. However, if you do talk to the Russian public, a lot of them will refer to American sources or Western sources advising that Trump will be the better choice for the president because he will be in power to stop the Ukrainian-Russian war. And that's what the Russians want for the most part right now. Thank you, James, for having me on your show. And there'll be more reports from various places in the world. This is right now a hot spot of filth, Quebec, Montreal. Signing off, Alex Sasho.
That's a perspective we haven't heard about in the US. We'll pause for a moment for our sponsors, then we'll be right back with Uncensored Beat. Welcome to Uncensored Beat.
I showed up. US citizen is not permitted entry.
Whatever the next big attack.
Zelensky's seemingly fraudulent election.
Welcome back. I'm James on the Go. Please help us by visiting our sponsors. Click, like, and follow.
In the past segment, we talked about the 10-year bilateral security agreement that Biden signed with Ukraine, its possible ties to NATO expansion, and the Russian perspective about the Ukraine conflict. We've heard from the mainstream media about the position of the government of Ukraine. I wonder if the Ukrainians themselves share a similar perspective.
There are reports that many Ukrainians are being censored and being prevented from sharing their views. However, we've collected some views relating to our topic today. Let's take a listen. We were curious about the Ukrainian perspective to the same questions that we asked the Russian community. And here are the responses.
What do Ukrainians think about US? That's a difficult question. It depends. Most people are negative. Some believe that the US is to blame for this war, and that it is the fault of the US that so many people have died. Others believe that the US is not doing enough to help Ukraine in its war with Russia. Z is skillfully manipulating the opinion of Ukrainians in Ukraine, and he is indoctrinating Ukrainians into thinking that all the defeats of the Ukrainian army are not his fault, but the fault of the US, which is not helping enough. 1/3 of us don't care. Many of those who came to the US from Ukraine are disappointed. They expected to see a completely different country. What do Ukrainians think about Russia? Opinions here are diametrically opposed. Some hate Russia. This hatred has been deliberately cultivated over the years. For others, Russia is the only hope for a better future. Everyone knows that Russia invests a lot of money in the territories it seizes, and people live much better there than in the territories controlled by the Ukrainian government. For example, no men can leave Ukraine. They are forcibly grabbed on the streets and sent forcibly to war. There is no such thing in Russia. Anyone can safely leave the territory of Russia. No one will stop him at the border. Also in Russia, there is no mobilization, unlike in Ukraine. Volunteers go to war, and there are a lot of them because they have high salaries and high social benefits. What do they think about NATO and its expansion? Those who can think are categorically against NATO expansion. NATO was created as a counterweight to the Warsaw Pact and the USSR. Gorbachev dissolved the Warsaw Pact, and the USSR ceased to exist. It would have been logical to dissolve NATO as well. But this was not done, and NATO, instead of a defensive organization, turned into an offensive and very aggressive structure. If you had 3 wishes to improve US and Ukrainian relations, what would they be? First, immediately stop the war. Second, remove the corrupt Zelensky government and hand over power to the Ukrainian military. Finally, to invest money not in weapons, not in war, but in the reconstruction of Ukraine. I am categorically against any kind of violence in any form. Who do you think would be the best next president of the US? Donald Trump, Robert Kennedy Jr., nephew of JFK, or Kamala Harris? I think Kennedy would be better, but he won't win. Trump's position is not very strong right now. Democrats have the media and the power. Besides that, a lot of powerful entities make money from war, and war is a source of profit for them. Kamala is a puppet and, well, a stupid. For the US, it will be a disaster, and for Ukraine, it will bring a lot of grief and many new deaths. Despite the difference in ideology, the USSR and the USA are very similar. What I see now in the USA, I have already seen in the USSR on the eve of collapse. My predictions are disappointing. If the US policy does not change radically, this country will collapse, and this collapse will come in our lifetime.
That's very different from what is shared from the US media today.
The bilateral agreement is written as if there is a strong agreement between the people of the US and Ukraine. The agreement has specific requirements for Ukraine, like requiring that Ukraine continue producing loss reports related to aid from the US, that Ukraine must continue to give the US access to reports, and must also generate transparent reporting for security assets and installments. The problem is that the recent audits show that this information never existed. Both audits from the US Government Accounting Office, the GAO, and the US Office of Management and Budget, OMB, mentioned a lack of appropriate financial reports. In fact, in the OMB audit, there was an independent auditing team that was involved. That team stated that the financial reporting process done by our government did not follow general accepted accounting procedures, also known as GAAP. James, with your background in corporate finance, can you tell us about GAAP and why we should care?
GAAP refers to generally accepted accounting principles. These are commonly recognized set of rules and procedures governing corporate accounting and financial reporting. They are used to ensure financial records of any organization, public or private, are sound, accurate, legitimate. It's a serious issue when you divert from GAAP practices. Banks and business that do are often closed down.
That's not all. There are other requirements that foreign aid, especially aid from former Soviet nations, should meet, and more requirements listed in the bilateral agreement. These include support of democracy and freedom, especially for aid sent to former Soviet Union nations, respect for human rights for aid sent to members of the former Soviet Union. And aid and funds need to be used according to their intended purpose per the requirements of the GAO and OMB standards. Military and security aid cannot be sold to another country or international organization, and the recipient country receiving this aid must have safeguards to prevent this. Confirmation is required that the military aid given to Ukraine was done as a result of an emergency. Waiver of military aid can also only be granted for specific countries, including those aligned with NATO.
These are all being signed off by the Secretary of State. The issue is simple. If the U.S. does not have a clear record of what was sent, then how can Ukraine confirm that all the aid was received and used appropriately?
In a previous podcast by Uncensored Beat called Smoke and Mirrors, we talked in detail about unfavorable audit findings by our own government entities, the GAO and the OMB. Both had bad results.
As part of our Ukraine Voices series, we'll be sharing a series of shorts that provide perspectives on how well the U.S. aid is being utilized by Ukraine. Please like and subscribe to the Uncensored Beat.
Welcome to Uncensored Beat.
I showed up. US citizen is not permitted entry.
Over the next big attack.
Zelensky's seemingly fraudulent election